Well, good morning. Welcome to New Life Christian Church. Great to see you here today. If you brought a Bible with you, would you please go ahead and open up to James chapter 1. That's where we're going to be today as we continue in our series that we started last week, a series called Faith That Works. We are studying through the book of James, verse by verse. And as you're finding your way there, what do you guys think of this stage? That looks pretty good, doesn't it? Yeah, you know what? We went out to Mount Ararat and found Noah's Ark and brought back some of the wood. And no, I'm kidding. We didn't make any trips except to the lumber store. But anyway, hey, it's great to see you here today. Hey, while you're finding the book of James, let me tell you about a reality show that was released years and years ago. I think it goes all the way back to 2001, 2002, so it's been quite a while. But the Fox Network, they're the ones that released this reality show. And when it became known that this show was going to hit the airwaves, it was very controversial. In fact, there was all kinds of hype surrounding it, and there were groups that had gotten together to try to stop this show from actually entering the schedule. And when I tell you what reality show it was, you'll know exactly why there was an attempt to stop it. The reality show all those years ago was called Temptation Island. Now, I've never seen it myself, nor do I care to, but Temptation Island was this unscripted reality television show where four couples agreed to be flown to this Caribbean island where, tropical paradise. You can just imagine the scene, just this beautiful setting for romance. And once they got to the island, these four couples were introduced to all of these eligible single people. And then they were separated from each other, and these couples didn't come back together until the end of their stay. Now, the whole object for these couples while they're on the island was to see if their love for each other was strong enough that would overcome temptation. And the object for the singles on the island was to see if they could tempt these couples to become unfaithful. You can see why this was such a controversial show, right? I mean, it's just garbage. A lot of people like garbage, as you know. In fact, when this show aired, when it debuted, 16 million people tuned in to watch the very first episode. And up to that time, that was the biggest audience that Fox had ever had when they debuted a show on a Wednesday night. Now, I don't know why somebody or a couple people would subject themselves to that kind of temptation. But the truth is this: we are all subjected to temptation each and every day. No, we're not on Temptation Island. You know what I think? I think we live on Temptation Planet. I mean, we're subjected to temptation all the time. It's all around us. There's not a day that goes by that we're not tempted with something. We don't have to look hard for it. We don't have to look far. We don't have to look wide. I mean, temptation is just there, and it is packaged in a variety of different ways. We're tempted to cheat. We're tempted to lie. We're tempted to gossip. We're tempted to hold grudges. We're tempted to steal. We are tempted to think impure thoughts. We are tempted to act on those impure thoughts. We are tempted to watch a certain channel that we know we shouldn't watch, and we are tempted to click on things that we know we shouldn't click on. We are tempted to not give our God our best, but to give from our leftovers. We are tempted all the time. And this subject of temptation, it is not a new idea by any means. In fact, it's one of the oldest things we read about in all of Scripture. You can go back to the very beginning pages of the Bible, and you can learn all about temptation. We first see it when Adam and Eve are in the garden, and God told them, do not eat from this one tree. Don't eat the fruit from this one tree. The rest is fine, but not this one tree. And of course, what did they do? They fell into temptation, and they ate that fruit that God told them not to. And from that moment on, we have seen numerous examples in Scripture of people who had come and faced temptation, and they failed miserably. Like, I'm reminded of a guy named Achan in Joshua chapter 7. He was an Israelite, and God had just given the Israelites this promised land. All they had to do is just go in and receive it and take it. And they were going to have to fight some battles along the way. And the very first battle they come to is the Battle of Jericho. You know, that's the one where the Israelites marched around the walls, and the walls fell down, and they took the city. And God said, don't take any of the plunder for yourselves. But this was a huge temptation for a guy named Achan who saw all this treasure, and he said, I'm just going to take a little bit because no one's going to notice. Nobody's going to pay attention to what I'm doing. So he takes a little bit of the treasure, and he hides it under his tent. Well, guess who noticed? God noticed. And so the very next battle, God didn't go with them, and they got whooped. And they're like, what happened? And God said, you got sin in the camp. And it was exposed that Achan had done this. See, Achan, he didn't think it was a huge deal. It was just a little thing. Just a little thing. But he succumbed to temptation. I read in 2 Kings chapter 5, there's a guy by the name of Gehazi there. You probably have never heard of Gehazi unless you're an avid student of the Old Testament. Gehazi was a friend, companion of the prophet Elisha. He's a guy that has watched Elijah do miracles and all of those things. And we read about this time where there was a man named Naaman who came to the prophet Elisha because he had leprosy. And he asked Elijah to heal him, and Elijah heals him. And then he wants to pay Elijah for this miracle. And Elijah's like, you're not going to pay me for that miracle. Have a nice day. I'm sure there's a few more words exchanged, but that was the gist of it. But then there's his friend, Gehazi. And he sees that the prophet Elijah had just pretty much left all this wealth and things that he could have had. He just said, don't worry about it. And so when Naaman goes and he's traveling home, he gets on his chariot and his bandwagon and goes back home. When Elijah's not paying attention, Gehazi travels up and he catches up with Naaman. And he says, you really do need to pay for that miracle. Right there in this moment of weakness, there was something going on. He came under temptation. He saw an opportunity, and greed entered his heart, and he wanted to have what he thought he deserved. Well, Elijah found out about it, because you really can't pass much by one of God's prophets. And he goes, why would you do such a horrible thing? And you know how he was punished? Elijah said, the leprosy that I healed from Naaman is now going to be on you. And he had leprosy for the rest of his life. I think about King David in the Bible. A lot of you know about King David's failure to resist temptation. He took another man's wife. He had an illegitimate child with her and ended up committing murder to cover up his sin. That wasn't the only time. Now we know that David was redeemed and restored and forgiven and all those things, but there was other times where David came under temptation and he failed miserably. There was the temptation of pride, and he wanted to take a census throughout his entire land. God said, don't do it. His advisor said, don't do it. But something about David is this pride, this temptation to be, look at me. And he takes this census of the area. 70,000 people lost their lives because of that. Samson is about as gifted of a person you'll ever come across in Scripture. He could not keep his eyes off the ladies. Could not keep his eyes off of what he could take and have, and ego and all of these things. And Samson died right there along with his enemies in shame. Couldn't resist temptation. I think about the prophet Balaam. Balaam was not a very good prophet. He was offered money one time from a king to curse the Israelites. Well, there's a conflict of interest. To be one of God's prophets and take some money, so you pronounce a curse on the Israelites. And so we read this horrific, terrible story about how Balaam tries to figure out how he can still get the money and still do these things over here. It's this long story, but it's like this temptation of greed. I want that money. He came to a tragic end. Ananias and Sapphira, in the New Testament, they were a couple of Christians who sold a piece of land, and they were supposed to give the money to the church. But greed, the temptation, we can take, we can have, and this feeling like we don't have to give it all. And so they came to Peter, and they gave him the money. And Peter said, hey, is this all the money for the land? Yep, sure is. They lied. And if you know the story, they dropped dead right there in the presence of Peter. Temptation. There's a man named Demas. He's mentioned 3 times in the New Testament. He was a friend of Paul's, the apostle. He was a fellow workman, traveled with Paul. Then as we're reading 2 Timothy chapter 4, we come to verse 10, and we learn this tragic news. Demas has abandoned Paul. Demas had abandoned the work of the ministry. Why? Because he was in love with the world. He chose the world. Temptation got the best of him, and he chose the world. Here's something that I know about every single one of us in this room today, and myself included. I know that we've all been tempted. Every single one of us has been tempted before. Anybody in this room never been tempted before? I wouldn't tempt you by asking you to lie. I know that about us. This is a room full of people that know what temptation is. You know what else I know about all of us? Every single one of us at some point in our lives have succumbed to temptation. Every last one of us. You know what else I know about everybody in this room, including myself? That even though we are saved, many of us are saved, we're forgiven, we live under God's grace, we're redeemed, we're sanctified, we're heaven-bound. Even though we're all of that, we're all susceptible to succumb to temptation again. Every last one of us. And as we continue our study today, this verse-by-verse study through the book of James, James has something very significant to say in our text today about temptation. Now, last week when we started our study, we learned that James is writing this letter to Christians who are scattered all around. They're scattered all over the region because of persecution. Persecution was very heavy. It's been going on for years and years. Now, the good thing is they took the gospel with them. They've won a lot of people to Christ, but these people are scattered, and they're experiencing trials. Life is difficult. Life is hard. And I would say many of them might be wondering, why am I a Christian if life is so hard? And so James says to them, consider it pure joy whenever you face trials of many kinds. And now what he's talking about, as we learned last week, I won't review everything, but that God is bigger than these trials. God is bigger than these hard times, and God is using them to shape you. He's not here to harm you. He's here to shape you into the kind of follower and disciple that he wants you to be. And then our text today, James is going to move seamlessly from talking about trials and considering it pure joy and all of that, and he's going to start discussing this idea of temptation. Now, there are many people who would say that James is changing subjects here, that James was talking about trials from verses 1 to 12, and now from verses 13 to 18, we're going to be talking about temptation. But, you know, the more I study this, I've kind of come to the opinion that I don't think James is changing subjects at all. I don't think James is switching topics. I think he's still talking about trials. I don't think he's moved on from that yet. Temptation is another form of trials that James is still talking about. They're not exactly the same, but they are cousins. They are connected. Trials and temptations go together. I'll explain this more as we get down in our text, but just let's get a feel for our text today. If you got your Bible, look at verse 18, and we're going to read to verse 13, and we're going to read to verse 18, and then we're going to come back and hit verse by verse. So James talks about trials, and then he says this in verse 13. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. And then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. Why would James choose to write about temptations right after he gets done talking about trials? Why would he do that? Why would he just move right from one into the other? Well, here's what I think. I think sometimes when God allows us to suffer, when life gets really tough, when things just don't seem to be going our way, when we experience these trials, I think it's during those times that we have a tendency to use our trials as an excuse for sinning. Like when things are tough, it's like, well, I'm going to let my guard down. I don't know why that is. That's human nature or what, but it's like when things get difficult and we don't understand and life is hard, it seems like we have a tendency to excuse our trials for sinning. Hard times and difficult seasons can often lead to some significant temptation. Now, here's something that I've learned about myself over the years, and perhaps you can relate to this. Perhaps you experience the same thing as I do. I've learned this about me, that I am at my most vulnerable moments. I am most susceptible to temptation when I'm experiencing difficult days, tension, and when things just don't seem to be going right. Now that's me. You know, man, I've recognized that in me. That when life gets difficult, relationships get strained, things don't seem to be clicking like they're supposed to. I've noticed in myself, that's when I seem to be the biggest target. And that's when I was like, I'm susceptible. And those are those moments when I've had to consciously go to places in the Bible like Ephesians, where it says, put on the full armor of God. I don't know why that temptation is there to just drop our defenses when things are tough. It's almost like you go into like, oh, I don't care anymore, whatever. But that's when we need to put our shields up the most. That's when we need to call upon the Lord the most. That's when we recognize we're vulnerable. I don't know why that is. At least it's true for me. And maybe that's what's going on, and that's why James writes to them. He's like, you guys are experiencing some difficult things. You guys are a lot of you are maybe wondering, is it worth being a Christian still? Why is this so difficult? It wouldn't be this hard if I wasn't following Jesus. And then he begins to talk about temptation. Look at verse 13. Let's go back and let's just kind of pick this apart, because I think it's going to shed some light on this discussion. James says, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. Now James begins by saying, when tempted. Let's not just blow past those first two words. Let's not just blow past it and miss something very significant here. It says, when tempted. Do you know what he doesn't say? He doesn't say, if tempted. He doesn't say, some of you might experience this. He's not saying, one day some of you might encounter temptation. He's not saying that at all. He's saying, when tempted. And I hope you receive that going, yeah, none of us are exempt. All of us will face temptation. It is a given. It is not an if, it is a when. And I think if we're being truly honest, some of us can say the when is right now. We're facing some significant temptation. When tempted. Do you ever wonder what it'd be like to live in a world without temptation? I have a hard time conceiving what a world without temptation would even be like, because temptation is all around us. Again, we live on Temptation Planet. Maybe that's why we have something to look forward to in heaven. It's one of the many things we have to look forward to. There is no evil. There is no temptation. We're not going to be tempted to do any of the things that we are tempted to do right now. So James is just acknowledging this point. Nobody is exempt from temptation. There's no place you can go on this world and totally get away from temptation. As long as we live in these fleshly bodies, we are going to be tempted to sin. I have some crazy thoughts that from time to time going, you know what, I wonder if I became a monk and I moved to the Swiss Alps and lived out my days, would temptation follow me there? Yes, temptation would follow me there. If you're a businessman right here in Northwest Arkansas, or maybe you're a housewife right here in Bella Vista, perhaps you're a student at the University of Arkansas, or you're an elder in this church, or even the pastor who gets to stand up here every Sunday. We'll all face temptation. It's not if. When tempted. So he says this to the church. Look at verse 13. When tempted, when you're tempted, you should never have this response. God's tempting me. God's tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. I wonder if this is something that the church was struggling with back in James's day. I don't know this for sure, but it seems like James is throughout the entire letter, he's just answering questions, one after the other. I don't know if the church had produced a bunch of questions and James was answering them, or if he just instinctively knew, or people had reported back, hey, James, there's a lot of people that are blaming God for their hard times, that are falling into sin, and they're actually blaming God from this. And whatever the reason is, he says, listen, when tempted, you should never say, God did this, or God's to blame, because God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. I'll tell you, I don't know what it is, but there is an epidemic going around our world today. And perhaps it was the same back in James' day. Perhaps it's always been like this, but there's an epidemic where nobody wants to accept responsibility for anything. And we're never at fault for anything. We're constantly in this mode of passing blame to somebody else. I have 2 young sons. You want to know how many times in a week I hear this? That's not my fault. That was him. He did this. Blame him. I hear it all the time. It's just something in human nature, but it doesn't leave us when we leave our childhoods. We want to pass the blame all the time. In fact, this was Adam and Eve's, this was their solution to when they sinned. If you were to go back to Genesis chapter 3 and read what happened, they ate the fruit, they recognized that they had sinned, that everything had changed, and one day they hear God walking through the garden. Okay? I don't know what that sounds like. I would love to know what that sounds like. But their response was to run and hide, and so they hide, and God shouts out to Adam, Adam, where are you? And it was just funny, like God didn't know where they were. He said, Adam, where are you? And Adam answered, I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. And I find God's response real curious. God said, who told you you were naked? And then God says, have you eaten from the tree that I told you not to eat from? Excuse me. And then Adam answered, and he answered with an answer that all men know really well. He said, the woman that you gave me, she did this to me. God, the woman that you gave. Do you hear the blame that's going on here? He said, you did this to me, God. The woman, you read my mind. Thanks. Sorry. See, third service, we're a lot more relaxed around here. We're like, oh, that fixed it. Thank you. He said, God, the woman you gave me, she did it. She did it. And do you see in this one phrase, he's blaming God first, and then he's blaming his wife second. This has been the response from the beginning. We want to shift blame. And of course, God makes very clear to Adam and both Eve that, no, there's no blaming around. You did this. You did this. Not me. You. And so, James makes that very clear in the text. Don't blame God when we fail. So let's ask the question. So where does temptation actually come from? Where does temptation actually come from? Let me tell you, friends, and I hope everybody in this room knows this. I hope that instinctively you know this. If not, let me share with you that every one of us have a common enemy, and his name is Satan. Every last one of us. We share this common enemy. He's referred to in Scripture as the father of lies. He's referred to as a deceiver. In fact, he's referred to with many different names. Matthew chapter 4 is an interesting name that he's given. Jesus has been baptized and he goes off into the wilderness. The Bible says that Jesus is there for 40 days and 40 nights. He didn't eat a thing. And then there's this curious little verse. It says, and then the tempter came to Jesus. The tempter. He's a tempter. He's a deceiver. He's a schemer. And we can read all about his activities all throughout the Bible. So when asking the question about where temptation comes from, I simply can't leave him out of the conversation. There's too much that he's involved with in the Bible and in this world for us to just say that he has nothing to do with it. No. Satan has so much to do with the temptation that we face, and his demons, they're actively involved. And a lot of, I say all of the evil that exists in the world is demonic in nature. It comes from him. But James, in this text, doesn't bring up Satan. So we ask the question, where does temptation come from? James doesn't bring up the devil at all. Now, if you'll stick with this series, you're going to find in the rest of the letter, James is not shy in telling us what he thinks of the devil. And I can't wait till we get a little bit later in the study. He even teaches us how to defeat the devil. But right here, James makes no mention of him. So what does James say? Look at verse 14 about temptation. He says, each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. Did you hear that? Did you understand what James is saying? James is saying that when we're tempted, It's our own fault if we fall into it. Now, Satan may very much be responsible for that temptation being tangled right in front of you, but when we jump at it, when we fail, James said there's only one person to blame there, and that's yourself. James uses two phrases in these two verses, and two phrases that really bring up hunting and fishing examples. The two phrases I want us to pay attention to is this. The first one is, they are dragged away. Do you see that in the text? Each person, when tempted, they are dragged away. And the second phrase, or the second word rather, is enticed. Enticed. Dragged away carries with it this idea of like baiting a trap. It's like a hunter who goes out into the woods and he sets a trap and he baits it and then he hides to see what he catches. That's what dragged away. That's the imagery that James wants us to capture. And if you look at the word enticed, in the original Greek language of the New Testament, that word that we get translated as enticed, it means this, to bait a hook. So James is talking about hunting, and he's talking about fishing descriptions here. Now, I'm going to make an assumption. I'm going to assume that the majority of us, at one point in our lives, we have dropped a fishing line in the water and tried to catch fish. Now that may not be true. I'm just going to assume. And if you have never done that, then at least you've seen it. You know what it's like. To be a really good fisherman, you got to figure out what kind of bait attracts the kind of fish that you're trying to catch. So depending on the type of fish and where you are, you may get some night crawlers, you may get some minnows, you may get your favorite lures, whatever it is, but you put something on that hook, you do something to draw it in, and you drop it in the water. And then here comes this fish, just swimming along, doing what fish do, just swim all day and night. They swim. What a horrible life. Swim all the time. And here comes this fish, and all of a sudden there's this bait, and it's on the hook, and I don't know what goes through a fish's mind, but the fish might say something like, wow, that looks good. And the fish, in that moment, has to make a decision. Do I chomp down on that bait, that thing that looks so good, the thing that looks so delicious? Do I chomp down on it, or do I swim around it, or swim underneath it, or swim away from it? I would imagine these are tough decisions for a fish. If you're a good fisherman and you've used the right kind of bait, then there's a really good chance that fish is going to take a bite. And the second it does, boosh, he's dinner. I went fishing one time, one of the very first times I can recall ever going fishing in college. A buddy of mine who lived in the dorms was like, hey, I got a couple of fishing poles. Let's go out behind. There was this little river that ran behind Ozark Christian College. And he's like, let's go drop a line in there and see if we catch something. I didn't think till later that might have been illegal because we didn't have licenses, but the Lord forgives. And so after the fact, I was like, I don't know if we should have done that. So we dropped the line in the water, and my friend says, all right, just drop it right here. We're standing around the bank, and he goes, there is a fish underneath that log. And so I just dropped the hook there, and sure enough, after a few minutes, this fish comes swimming out from under the log, and then it swims back. And then it swims back out to the hook, and it tucks back under the log. You had no idea you were going to get such information today, did you? And swam out there again. And I'm sitting there over the bank, like, bite it, get it, because I can see right down on it, get it. And then one time it came out, and it went for it. And I yanked, and there was no slack on the line, because I literally just had it dropped in there, and I yanked a lot harder than I need to, and that fish came flying out of the water. Whew, smacked, and I smacked it on the ground behind me. And I threw it back. I hope it survived. I'm not convinced. I don't know what happened to that little guy. I think about that, and I think that is the exact imagery that James wants the church to capture in this text. Dragged away, enticed. You see, no animal is going to deliberately step into a trap unless he's baited there. No fish is going to chomp down on a hook without some kind of bait unless you're just a really good fisherman or he's a really dumb fish. Temptation always carries with it some bait that appeals to our natural desires. Did you hear that? Temptation always carries with it some bait that is always crying out for our natural desires. It is the bait that attracts us. It's the bait that is the temptation. But the crazy thing about the bait that wants to lure us and entice us is that that bait is hiding something very destructive. And that's something we lose sight of often when it comes to temptation, because all we see is the bait. All we see is that thing that's going to give us pleasure. All we see is something that's yummy. And we totally miss the danger that that bait is hiding. It's the bait that's the exciting part. Like I think back in the Old Testament, a guy named Sodom. Sodom was a guy Lot was a guy that moved to the city of Sodom, just outside Sodom. And wondered, why would he do that? It was an evil, wicked city. And we read Genesis chapter 13, and then we see this little detail that Sodom, when he looked towards the city, he saw that the plains of the Jordan were well watered and great for growing crops. He saw something he wanted, and that took him to Sodom. It was the bait. I think about David. I think about how he looked on that roof that one day, and he looked down on Bathsheba. All he saw was the bait. All he saw was the temptation. And I wonder, what would have happened if David could have looked past the temptation and could see the consequences? No adultery would have happened if he could have done that. There would never have been a death of a baby had he been able to do that. A brave soldier would have not lost his life in a murderous cover-up had David been able to look past the bait and see the consequences. And that's the most dangerous part about temptation, or the bait. It keeps us from seeing the dangerous parts. You know, whenever you're faced with temptation, and I would say not if, but whenever, which all of us are facing that, if we could somehow, as Christians, as disciples of Jesus, get our eyes off the bait and look ahead to see the consequences that it's hiding, we would do ourselves a tremendous service. Because let's face it, sin is very pleasurable. If sin wasn't pleasurable, why would any of us have anything to do with it? If sin wasn't so pleasurable, why would people risk reputations? Why would they risk their careers? Why would they risk their families just for a small taste of it? If the bait on the end of the hook did not look like something good to eat, the fish would never take a bite. And temptation is exactly like that for us. It looks good. It looks appealing. It looks like something we want to participate in. It's fun, and it feels good. However, as pleasurable as sin can be, the enjoyment of it only lasts for a very short time. The words the Bible says, you reap what you sow, come pouring in to this text. If you were to commit adultery, or you were to have premarital relationships, it is pleasurable in the moment. But when that marriage is ruined, and you only get to see your kids on the weekends, in the end, the pain of that pleasure, the pain of it just way outweighs the momentary pleasure. You know, as a pastor, I've seen many times, unfortunately, people who fall into temptation and deeply regret it. Running around with friends and seems innocent enough, and you have a little too much to drink one night, and you're like, oh, well, it's not a big deal. That is, until you see the flashing red and blue in your rearview mirror, or even worse. Slam your car into a tree, and you live with that for the rest of your life. See, it's the bait that we see. And that bait disguises the danger and the consequences. So James says, no one, when tempted, should blame God for that. But I'll tell you, there's some incredibly good news in the Bible. And I'll tell you, it's a verse that I cling to, and I hope it's a verse that you cling to as well, because the last few minutes have been kind of down in the dumps kind of talk. But here's the good news of it. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, it says this, no temptation has overtaken you. In other words, no temptation. There's not a temptation that this doesn't apply to. There's not a thing out there, there's not a bait out there that you're ever going to come across that this doesn't apply to. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. And some of you are going, there's more? Because I feel like I'm at my max. But it says that God is faithful, and He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. And then He says, when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. And what He's saying is that, we'll go back to the fish analogy. When you come across that hook and it's baited and you're focused in on, what God is saying here is that there's always a way out. There's always a way around. There's always a way to go under. There's always a way to go above it. There is a way out, but the problem is we get so fixated on that one little piece of bait, and we can't see past it. We can't see beyond it to see the consequences. See, I believe that if we can figure out a way to just even momentarily take our eyes off of that thing that looks so desirable, then we'll be able to see God's solution to get around it. But we got to take our eyes off the bait, and that's the biggest problem in temptation. We get fixated, we get focused, that's all we see. And we fixate on it, and we possess over it. But if there's some way as a church we could just look beyond it and see where it leads, I think if we can do that, we'll see God's solution to get around it fairly easily. I could spend more time there, but let's look at verse 16. Let's wrap up our discussion this morning. In verse 16, James says this, don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above. Where is it from? It's from heaven. The things that are good in this world are from heaven. She's saying, don't blame God for temptation. He doesn't deserve that. He can't be tempted. He's not one that's going to promote evil. God gives good things, and those things come from heaven, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruit of all creation. God doesn't tempt us. God gives things to us. See, here's a part of when it comes to temptation that's really hard to see in the moment. Do you understand the stuff I'm talking about in the moment is so difficult to see? But I believe we can do it. I believe God will help us do it. But here's the thing. When we are fixated on the bait, we forget that bait is minuscule compared to the good things that God has already given us. And think about it. That thing in your life right now that you desire so much, and you could even probably acknowledge, I'm just being tempted. It pales in comparison to what God has already given to you. Now, I go back to David. I've referenced him several times, King David. David, in the moment of temptation, he failed to recognize the goodness of God. In that moment when he was on that roof and he saw Bathsheba and he fixated on that, he failed in that moment. This led to sin. He failed to recognize all that God had done for him. For some reason, all of that got shifted off to the side. He just wanted that one thing. And then when the prophet Nathan comes to confront him, in not so many words, but he even tells him, you forgot the goodness of God. You missed it. In that moment, you missed it. And let me just share with you what he said. Nathan came to confront David on this sin, and he says this. This is what the Lord God of Israel says to you. So it's God speaking through Nathan, right to David. So God says to him, I anointed you king over Israel. What a tremendous gift that God gave to David. Out of all the people in the entire world that could have been given that good gift from God, he gave it to David. And so the first thing God says to him through Nathan is, I gave you this stuff. You wanted this little desirable moment, but I gave you all this stuff and you forgot about it. And then he says, I delivered you from the hands of Saul. If you know David's life, there are multiple times King Saul wanted to kill him before he ever became king. And he said, I took care of that for you. I gave that to you. And he says, I gave you your master's house to you and your master's wives in your arms. I gave you all of Israel and Judah, basically the entire nation of Israel to lead. And then God said, and if all of that had been too little, I would have given you even more. I'll tell you what, I haven't completely got figured out how we avoid temptation, resist it, and all those things. James is going to help us as we get deeper in the series with this. But I do know this, that the next time you're tempted, the next time that Satan or wherever this bait drops in front of you, if you can look past that bait and see the consequences, and you can remember that God's goodness in your life, you can get around that. You can get past it. You can go under it, around it, over it. You can get around it if you remember God's goodness. And I said, do you think you can do that in the moment of temptation? I don't need that. God has been too good for me. Has done too many good things for me. See, I think if David would have recognized God's goodness, I know there wouldn't have been an affair. There wouldn't have been an illegitimate child. That child wouldn't have died unnecessarily. Uriah wouldn't have died a murderous death. And David would have been spared the pain and guilt and suffering of that decision. So next time you're tempted, can you meditate on God's goodness instead? You know, there's more that we could say here. I always have more than what I have time for. Why don't we draw a line right there? Can I pray for you? Dear Heavenly Father,